Hello, and welcome back to Build Back Liberal. This series explores how the Liberal Democrats can build a progressive centre-left agenda going forwards. Today, I'm joined by Tom King. Hello.
Hi, Ryan.
Would you care to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very good to be with you on this show. Um, my name's Tom King. I started off my career working for various Lib Dem politicians, chief among which were David Howarth, who was then the Cambridge MP, and following his decision to stand down, Julian Huppert, who I know has previously appeared on these shows. I started off as a policy case worker in insurances and then progressed to the corridors of power with Julian as a speechwriter and advisor before embarking on a different kind of career in what you might call political risk. That's my day job. I advise mostly investors, sometimes companies, on the changing landscape of regulation and policy. And how to mitigate the effects of that on their business. But then sort of parallel to that and sometimes cutting into that has been, I suppose, a long-held interest and hopefully deepening understanding of liberal politics, which led to a couple of years that I spent in Bosnia working for an investigative journalism charity. That was very much focused on anti-corruption, and we did things like the Panama Papers and other major investigations that were sort of cross-border, and that's become a major interest of mine as well. So a bit of a mixed bag, really. I also grew up partly in the UK, partly in Brazil, so I've always had a quite internationalist outlook, and one of the first things I can remember is Paddy Ashdown talking about Bosnia during the Bosnian War, in the early 90s, and that really lit a flame in me about Bosnia in particular, but also about liberal views and approaches to internationalism.
I started as a caseworker myself, my first sort of political job. Unfortunately, I started a bit too close to the 2015 election for my career to progress much further than that in the Lib Dems. So, the Generous Society. What on earth is it, and how did it come about?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that has characterized my view of the Lib Dems in the UK and liberal politics perhaps in general, and I've spent most of my last 4 or 5 years between the UK and the US, and I would say that all of this kind of applies in both countries to an extent, is that while we talk a lot, not just in liberal movement, but in general about the UK and the US being liberal democracies, we've actually failed to define what we really mean by that. And in my view, we've never actually achieved what that means. Speaking about the Lib Dems as a party, I joined around the time of the Iraq War initially and marched against the war, and sort of, as I mentioned, the interest in Bosnia and other types of Lib Dem views on Hong Kong, for example, all of that kind of internationalism was very interesting. But if you then look at Brexit and the fact that the Lib Dems have been sort of on the right side of various big arguments in British politics, that's why a lot of people like the party, I think. But I don't think that equates to a particularly liberal or particularly democratic vision. And so obviously the last 4 years has kind of, or 5 years, have really added to this question of really what are the Lib Dems for? What is it that we're actually offering? And we're very good at policy. We have lots of policy detail. Conference always comes up with interesting ideas. There's lots of good debate. That's fine. What I am worried about is the fact that if you ask a typical voter, and I know lots of people who, are sympathetic to the Lib Dems, but if you ask them what the Lib Dems actually want, what they think a good society looks like, what they want Britain to be, they won't have a good answer. They don't know what the answer is to that question. I remembered back to when I was working for David, he had mentioned, David Howarth, he'd mentioned Radikale in Denmark, which is a sort of a sister party of the Liberal Democrats. And they had done a vision called The Creative Denmark in about 2005, I think they published it. And the purpose of this was to actually give a 15-year view of what they wanted to do for Denmark, what they wanted Denmark to become. And I always found that very inspiring. But I sort of started pushing that idea. And so we sort of discussed how we might approach that, and discussed also the pandemic and how that was raising a lot of long-term questions, how we might approach public health, but also how we might approach income inequality, racial inequality, these kinds of issues. And we basically ended up producing this document. And really it's split into two parts. The first is kind of a bit of a survey of some of the issues I've just talked about. And the second is more of an explicit list of freedoms that speaks to the overall vision that we want to achieve.
So in that first section, you talk about these different realms where for shaping a liberal vision. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So I think the way I was trying to shape that was really a lot of the problem that we seem to have as a movement, as a party, is that when people encounter this idea of individual sovereignty, the idea that you are the best person to make decisions about your life, if you put it like that, some people are usually on board with it. But if you then get into a discussion about how that relates to other types of social structure, particularly larger communities, cities, government itself, people often see that there's something of a battle going on between the individual and the collective, right? And this is what I'm trying to tackle in the four realms, is actually dealing with those one after another. So we split this into four realms. So there's the personal realm, the political realm, the social realm, and the global realm. And the idea of that is really that each of those can be seen as a sort of larger concentric circle, but always around the individual. We start with the personal because we value non-conformity. One of the key things about liberalism, and probably the most understated aspect of liberalism, is that we believe that we don't want people to be the same. We don't see people primarily as a unit, or as a unit of capital, or a worker, or some other constrained identity. The whole point of what we're trying to do is to generate a society in which people have the freedom to choose for themselves how they appear, how they live, how they interact. Once we accept that that's the view that we have of individuals and people as humans, we need to then move into this idea of the political realm as something that enables us to extend our choice and our sovereignty as much as possible into the public sphere. And, our vision for society has to be pluralistic if we're starting from the point of view that everyone is different. And so that's where the political realm and extending and improving transparency of view and of opinion is very important. Now, I think the social realm is probably the most important one in terms of moving past this idea of individuals or humans as purely economic units. And I think a lot of what we talk about when we talk about society stems from this very productivist view of humans. We have the challenge, which is that governments often don't treat us as individuals. They treat us as units of labor, where the choices that we make are subsumed into this idea of the economy, the good of the economy, and therefore the choices we make about our education, or the skills we want to learn, or the time we want to spend on certain things are less important than keeping things going. I think one of the things that the pandemic has really shown us, and that sort of could help us think about this, is that non-monetary benefits that we gain from living in community, non-monetary benefits that we gain from time spent in other places than work or the home, all of that has been sort of magnified, and the richness of life that comes from those places, whether it's the pub or the gym or whatever you choose to do with your time, I think all of that's being magnified by lockdown in particular. So that's one aspect of the social realm. The other aspect, of course, and this was something that we didn't address in great detail in the Generous Society, was the natural world and the environment, and how climate change and green space and clean air and all of those issues and renewable energy all contribute to our sense of a richness in how we interact with the world. And so I'm hoping that we're going to follow up on the initial vision with some more on that point. But I think we can include all of that in what we might call the social realm. I think finally is the global realm, and I've talked about this already in terms of my own interests in internationalism. I think one of the key areas that we need to think more about and that a vision needs to rest on is really coming back to the idea of rule of law as an equalizing force within a country, between the normal people and the mighty and powerful, which is obviously at risk in the UK at the moment, but also the way that the UK interacts with other countries, whether it's through the internationalized finance system, whether it's through trade, or whether it's through merely and simply breaking the law that you've agreed with other nations.
So you go on from talking about the different realms into a series of freedoms, and these are sort of how you frame what a liberal vision could look like.
So the first sort of the quote at the top of that section is from the Lib Dem Constitution, and it's one that if you're a Lib Dem or have been for any length of time, you hear a lot. This idea that no one should be enslaved by poverty, ignorance, or conformity. And so we basically took those three concepts, those three evils, let's call them, and split the freedoms out below each of those. And I think it's quite a nice way of demonstrating continuity with what the party has stood for, but also perhaps going into slightly more radical territory around what that might mean for modern Britain.
Obviously, because you've drawn from the Constitution, it sounds very familiar to Lib Dems and people with, aware of liberal traditions. That way of identifying that distinction is reminiscent of beverage. Where liberals have the most difficulty is around reconciling this question around poverty, reconciling individual freedom with how we can ensure that nobody gets left behind by society. So can you sort of explain where you go in addressing this area?
I think this has been the most challenging part of it in terms of drafting, and that's because the implication of the liberal belief in individual freedom and individual sovereignty is actually very radical, and always has been. And I don't think you would find too many Lib Dems who would disagree with that as a statement. But as you say, how you get there is a different matter, and what you actually think is necessary to get there is a different matter. What does it actually mean? I think this has been the most challenging part of it in terms of drafting, and that's because the implication of the liberal belief in individual freedom and individual sovereignty is actually very radical, and always has been. And I don't think you would find too many Lib Dems who would disagree with that as a statement. But as you say, how you get there is a different matter, and what you actually think is necessary to get there is a different matter. What does it actually mean? What is a basic need? And I suppose the pandemic has demonstrated this pretty boldly, I would say, in terms of what we actually do need. And specifically, I think what we need regardless of our own abilities. So one of the problems that we face in modern society is this kind of myth of meritocracy, where the idea is that people rise to the level that their abilities and their work and their effort deserve, which is actually a very it's a very insidious idea, I think. It's one where the corollary of, you've got where you've got because you've put the work in and you've succeeded, is if you haven't got to where you want to be, it's your fault. And I don't know if you read any Michael Sandel, but he's just published a book precisely on this issue called The Tyranny of Merit, and I think the pandemic demonstrates this point remarkably well. There are lots of people who, for the first time perhaps, are in poverty or struggling through no fault of their own, and with no relationship between their talents, their work, their education, and their life circumstances. And of course, that should tell us that lots of people who were in that position already also don't deserve to be in that position. There's no relationship at all between those two things. So I think that's where I started from, was, if we put to one side this kind of quite insidious idea that, we get to where we get to primarily because of our own work or our own choices, and instead we try to create a society in which the barriers to you making choices are lowered or removed. That's, to me, where a discussion of liberal economic policy has to come from. And that's a very generous concept, and that's partly why we ended up with this name, the Generous Society, because that implies a level of generosity in various directions, both to ourselves as individuals, from the state to us, and from us to other people. So the generosity flows in various different directions.
So obviously this podcast series has been inspired by recent events of Liberal Democrats, particularly Layla Moran's Build Back Better, and then the leadership campaign and the ideas that were being generated and discussed within that. How do you see the Generous Society fitting in with those other things that have been going on within the Liberal Democrats?
It's obviously a question that we were considering actively while we were writing, and then while we were trying to figure out when to publish it, because we didn't want to cut across that debate. We wanted that debate to happen fully and frankly, and not to necessarily steer anything in between what people were saying. I think it's a very good accompaniment to what was discussed in the leadership election. And I think it's a very good accompaniment to some of the ideas in Build Back Better. And I think the reason for that is what I kind of tried to outline at the start, that Build Back Better was a very good example of Lib Dem thinking, the variety, the breadth, but also the depth of what the party can come up with. I think it's a long overdue contribution, but it's definitely not a comprehensive and clear narrative about what we want for society. It's very much lots of good ideas, often actually slightly contradictory ideas, which is kind of the point. And so I think the two can be read in conjunction and actually considered in conjunction quite well. And I would say the same for ideas that are outside that publication. I think I really want to be clear that what we're trying to do is generate a discussion around what the party explicitly is and wants to do. And then Build Back Better, to me, is ideas for how you get there. And I don't think many of the ideas for how you get there are misaligned, particularly with what I wrote.
I think you're absolutely right in that the thing the Liberal Democrats struggle with most is articulating vision, and how we it's almost very intrinsic to Labour and the Conservatives. Their view of society is very obvious.
I would argue that neither of the major parties has articulated a particularly clear vision for society either. I think they've both moved away pretty much. I mean, What they do have is a vestigial idea that they are committed to certain things, right? So the Conservatives have this idea of being the party of business, of trade, of private enterprise, of meritocracy in the sense I was talking to earlier. Labour still has this vestigial idea that they're going to look after the vulnerable, that they're going to stand up for the working person, that they're going to ensure that there's a safety net. And actually, both of these parties have failed entirely to promote policies that achieve these outcomes. So I think, when you look at the detail of policy and how it stands up against this kind of vague idea of what those parties do and stand for, I don't think it actually stands up at all. But as you say, they do have this kind of vestigial thing that people kind of think they get, which we don't. Lib Dems don't even have that. And that's the problem. We need to start promoting that. If we can start associating ourselves in people's minds with freedom, generosity, those kinds of words, which we have a lot in this document, that will be a huge shift in our favour. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot this year, and more so as we progress through this year, which has been an unusual experience, is this idea of breathing. So if I could go back and rewrite this vision, there would be more about breathing in it. And I think there are several reasons for that. The first is, what I'm really advocating in the generous society is giving people the space to breathe, is giving every human the freedom to breathe and think for themselves and make their own decisions. And that makes it sound very small, but actually when you start to think about that, it opens up a lot of the things that we're all thinking about right now. So lockdown, even the fact that some people object to wearing face masks is related to breathing, as some people find it very difficult, legitimately, to breathe with a face mask on. But obviously, the debate around wearing masks is a wider question about government intervention and whether you should be forced to do things and those kinds of issues. So that's one. Another one is climate change, wildfires, air pollution in major cities. What happens to traffic when everyone's staying at home? Those kinds of questions, which go to ecological meanings of breathing. How is the planet breathing? How are we going to make sure that we continue to have places to live and avoid flooding people's homes and that sort of thing? That's another meaning. A third meaning might be racial justice. So the very sad and tragic murder of George Floyd, where he can't breathe, and others like him who have been brutalized by the police force and by law enforcement. And the wider need for people of colour and other types of minority group to be supported, to be given not just equal rights, but equity and inclusion. That's another type of breathing again. And I just think it's, the more I think about this idea of generosity, the idea of a society in which we're given space to breathe, I think is something I want to come back to.
So what do Liberal Democrats need to do next in terms of shaping our vision? We've got Build Back Better, we've got the Generous Society, we've got this Build Back Liberal podcast series. What tangible steps do Lib Dems need to follow in shaping a coherent vision ahead of presumably the 2024 general election?
Yeah, good question. I'm not in a position to really advise on that. I think what I would do if I were in a position to advise on that would be to really treat this next 4 years as a reset. And I think the party's gone from election to election largely without really strengthening anyone's understanding of who we are and what we do. I think we now have a very clear, there's almost no likelihood of an early election in my view now. It's going to take a long time for the Conservatives to dig the country out of this hole. And they're not going to want to rush into a reckoning. So for us, that creates a huge amount of space. And it also seems to me that Labour are playing very much the steady as you go straight bats, very few kind of radical ideas, agenda under Starmer, which again implies to me that we have an opportunity to really carve out some new ground, relaunch, rethink, and how we go about that is up to obviously the leadership, but also up to the party. And I think one of a few things that I want to do is really build on what we've written in this vision, go into a bit more detail on particularly the economics and the climate change issue, which have both been sort of criticisms of what we did, so it didn't really have enough on those. And then potentially bring that to conference in some way, whether that's in more discussion, whether it's in motions, whatever it might be. So there's lots of different routes.
I think that's really key, is thinking that we do have time. And I became a parliamentary candidate in 2016. And at the time I was thinking, right, I've just become a PPC. I've got 4 years to build up and develop my constituency till the 2020 general election. It is 2020 now, and we had 2 before we even reached 2020. We've had Brexit referendum. We've had a whole series of event after event after event. Now, most Liberal Democrat members and have joined the party since 2015, so have joined in this period of frantic activity. But actually, I think we're in a more bizarrely normal phase of politics now, where we do have a period of years in which to get this right. We're not going to be going to the public in a big way between now and the next general election. And as you say, that's most likely to be in 2024. And so how we make use of that time and that space, I think, was really important. What would a Liberal Democrat Britain look like? And I think it's great that what you've done and what Layla was trying to do in the leadership campaign has started that conversation in a level of depth that it hasn't been had probably since before the Liberal Democrats were last in government.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, the other thing to say is that beyond the sort of party political, there's also a mood in the country of change. I think the pandemic just throws up so many areas of policy where people are open to more radical solutions. The Conservative government has had to borrow £400 billion, which, if anyone had given you odds on that in 2016, you'd be a very rich person. So we're in a very, very strange situation. But as you say, it's also kind of a normal political situation where that one party has a big majority, and the benefit of being in opposition is that we can say radical things. And I think that's one of the things that Layla was trying to do. I hope Ed does that more and more as he grows into the leadership. But I think it's for us as party members and as Liberals to sort of push that as well.
I think as well, there's possibly there's been a sense of liberalism in retreat in recent years with Brexit in the UK, Donald Trump in America, the trends in various other countries towards authoritarianism, India, Turkey, etc. But and maybe I'm being over optimistic, I think we're starting to see a turn in that the nationalist right may have overreached somewhat. In the US, it doesn't, we're still a few days from the US election, touching wood, it doesn't look great for Donald Trump. In the UK, we're now moving towards a no-deal Brexit, which, while obviously bad for the country, is not what the Conservatives had promised people, and is really narrowing the base of people who think what they're doing is a good idea. And their response to the pandemic being so shaky has added to that. And I think, and in Poland, where the far right have been tried to ban abortion, they've now got protests on a scale they haven't seen since the fall of communism. And hopefully we are at a turning point where there is not only space for us to come up with new ideas, but actually an appetite for a move in that direction from the public.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, there are other areas as well where a liberal voice is sorely needed. So the one I think of right now is, you mentioned the government's sort of shaky response to the pandemic. I think that's true on a public health level, but it's also been incredibly poor and actually fraudulent, I would say, on a sort of procurement and corruption level, which, I don't see too many politicians pointing out, but there's certainly a lot of civil society pointing that out. And I think, you're right, the nationalist right has overreached, but it's also the consequences of reality catching up with the nationalist right, isn't it? It's what happens when you claim to be post-truth. The truth is still there, and it's still relevant, and it still, in the end, plays its part. And that's what we're going to find. And liberals should be on the side of the truth and on the side of the evidence, and we should be using that, hopefully, not just to be effective opposition, but to be really proud advocates of a real alternative.
So, a final thing that I'm asking everybody I'm interviewing in this series, in period, is about the US election. It's sort of hard to ignore completely because it is the biggest political event in the world right now, with fundamental implications for humanity. But also, we don't want to. We could talk about this for hours. So what I'm asking, and I've been asking each person, is for one thing that you've lesson or idea that you have about what's happening over in America right now that you think that we should be taking away from what's going on.
Yeah, it's a very good question and very hard to narrow down. I think I am actually in the US at the moment, and have been traveling around a bit and listening to what people are saying. And I think I don't think there's too much we can learn that's explicitly about liberalism, but I think in terms of how Joe Biden has managed to marry a really quite pessimistic message about the pandemic with a very optimistic message about human dignity and about decency, that's been very instructive, because he hasn't shirked telling people the truth, but I don't get the impression that lots of people think he's talking the country down. And that's a very tough line to tread, and I think we can learn a lot from that, even if I might not major on the same things as he majors on.
That's really interesting. I've always sort of subscribed to the view that the two most important things in electoral politics are strength and trustworthiness. A leader needs to be seen as someone who's strong, who has a clear idea about what they want to do and how they're going to do it. There's different kinds of strength. There's what this kind of strength that Trump tries to project, but I think Biden does in a different way in terms of with competence and clarity of ideas and the plan. And then there's honesty and trustworthiness, which is where Biden is so strong and is doing so well, contrasting with Trump.
Yes, and that's a very difficult thing for a third party or a fourth party to do, right? Because we don't have the luxury of claiming that we're going to have some major power after the next election. That's all the more reason to think about what we actually want to promote and what we actually want to stand for. And there's two ways of doing that. And I think we could do both. I think we should be, strongly talking about keeping the bastards honest, frankly, but also having a very compelling vision for what we would do. And I think that's where that kind of pessimism and optimism, we can somehow achieve both there.
Well, thank you so very much.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Build Back Liberal. Next time, I'll be joined by former Minister Lynn Featherstone to talk about inequality. Take care and stay safe.